let's talk about the South China Sea. And there's a lot of different competing national and some, in some respects, international interests at play there. It's a very confusing situation, even for me, who spent some time in China. And there are different claims, like historically and I guess militarily, to the land and islands that are at play. Can you briefly explain kind of what we see in the South China Sea right now?
Well, you're right to say that it's complicated, and I can't lay claim to being fully across all of those complicated aspects. Uh, but I think, generally speaking, we can say this. China claims, has ill-defined claims as to its sovereignty over the entire sort of territory of the South China Sea, including the waters. The best we have out of China in terms of the definition is this so-called nine-dashed line, which even China does not say delimits or fully defines what it means by its sovereignty over the South China Sea. Rather, it says things like, we have historical claims. We've been historically in these waters, and that gives us a certain degree of sovereignty. Now, the problem with
That's because of the oil in the islands, right? Is that what's valuable about?
Well, we've heard for a long, long time that there are these vast energy deposits. I don't think we've yet seen the evidence that that's entirely true. There's some, but I don't think it's to the degree that some of the more positive and optimistic folks would suggest. I'm sure there are certainly resource questions. It's not just the oil and gas deposits. It's fisheries, extremely important fisheries, fish stocks there. But maybe even more, I think more important than either of those is the broader sovereignty question. This is an issue of pride and sort of international legitimacy and expectation, I think, on the part of the Chinese to be given, sort of granted, if you will, the acceptance of the international community that this area is one where China's the hegemon, China is the dominant power, and it wishes to assert control there in a way not dissimilar, in my view, for example, than, say, the United States might wish to lay claim to the Caribbean Ocean, right? I mean, the United States does not make territorial claims, specific territorial claims over the entire Caribbean Ocean. But I think everybody understands who's running the show there. Not even a sovereign country of Cuba is able to oust the United States off of the corner of its island, Guantanamo, right? Where the United States has been for decades and decades, basically saying, we're here, what are you going to do about it? I think China would like something similar, that there's just a sort of international acceptance of who's boss in that area. Now, that said, there are specific territorial claims, and that's where it really gets quite confusing. And of course, you have the case of China actually building islands that they now wish to have then territorial seas around, right? And that is, just entirely contrary to international law. And it's not only building those islands so that they can then extend, their territorial claim, but of course they've militarized several of them as well. Now, there's a lot of question as to whether or not those are just big fat targets for a superior, technologically sophisticated adversary to destroy in relatively quick time, or whether they have meaningful military purpose. And that's a debate that is ongoing in the field. But anyway, just the long story short, highly contested area for resource reasons, for sovereignty reasons, for national pride reasons. Highly contested area as well because it's such an important area for the passage of international trade. And it's extremely important to others like the United States who want to assert as full and absolute freedom of navigation in international waters as possible. U.S. is a maritime power. That's normal and natural. So all of these issues converge in a way that make this a very highly contentious and contested area.
Yeah, I have heard some talk about the kind of trade, the maritime trade passages, and because China relies, I think, a lot on imports, right? China exports a lot, but also relies a lot on imports. And my understanding is a lot of the arguments coming out of China is that, well, if we don't control the seaways, we could be strangled on food or resources within 2 or 3 weeks, right? Yeah. And as a national security interest, we're just going to take it, and I don't care what you say. And I think that's a pretty hard argument to kind of reject based on international law, in the sense that I don't know how much we are actually committed to international law in, for example, like allied operations in the Middle East, right? My understanding is that there's a lot of international law which kind of gets waived for us to pursue operations there. But then at the same time, you have, I think, these like the Hague court ruling or something which says most of the South China Sea should go to the Philippines. I guess how important do you think international law is in these disputes, and how much should we respect it as opposed to just giving in to the powers that are in the region?
I'll try to respond to that, but let me just make a few words about a very important point you made, and that is China's vulnerability to disruptions in their external trade. Very, very important. You consider just how dependent China is on the openness of seaways, especially to its eastern seaboard. And if you look at a map, unfortunately we don't have one to really point to here, but
we might be able to throw one up.
Around China is what's known as the first island chain. You hear that word bandied about a fair bit when we talk about the geopolitics and geostrategy of China. The first island chain. Now basically that is a sort of imaginary line that you could draw from the southern tip of the Korean peninsula, and then extending southward through the Japanese islands, especially the far southern islands of Japan, Taiwan, into the Philippines, and sort of around the bottom of the South China Sea, you've got the Indonesian archipelago, and up to Vietnam. This is a barrier. This is a potentially threatening and already challenging geopolitical problem for China. Sometimes it's described as the Malacca dilemma. When you consider that such an enormous amount of energy and raw materials, agricultural goods, and of course Chinese exports as well, pass through the Malacca Strait. If you were to shut that down somehow, which militarily would probably not be an overly difficult thing to do, that would be devastating for China. So it's a problem, not just the Malacca Strait, but these other small passages that could get out into the open ocean past the first island chain. And who's on the first island chain? The United States, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, all U.S. allies. And so China's dilemma here is to figure out a way, not necessarily to control or dominate or invade, but to develop a military that is capable of either deterring action by others that might block that first island chain and bring China to its knees, potentially to its knees economically, or, if necessary, defeat in that maritime area an enemy that's determined to do that to them, right? So I think building out its presence in the South China Sea is a part of a much longer term strategy that is going to try to deal with that problem. How does that then affect international law? Well, the Chinese have rejected the Hague Arbitral Tribunal's decision on its claims in the South China Sea. This was a case that the Philippines had brought. So international law is sort of on the side, I guess, of the rest of the world that says, China, you don't have sovereign claims over a lot of what you're claiming there. But China's rejected it. So the question is, does international law matter here? Well, maybe not. because the last time I looked, the Hague Tribunal does not have an army. And who is going to enforce the Hague Tribunal decision? No one. We all say the right thing, and I think it's right always to say, well, look, this is international law, we have to abide by the rule of law, etc. But there is no military, not even the United States, that is fully prepared to enforce these decisions, right? The best that we see happening, or the only thing really available to militaries or to governments that want to sort of assert and try to reinforce or underscore the importance of these decisions, would be like the United States, perhaps other militaries that carry out these so-called freedom of navigation operations, which the United States claims are fully compliant with international law. China claims often are not.
Well, even just yesterday, there was a news article I read before I came in that the US had sent a naval patrol past 2 Chinese military outposts, which the Chinese weren't too happy about. They called it provocative, and that the US should withdraw.
Yes.
An extra interesting point that came up when I talked to Professor James Lawrenson from the Australia-China Relations Institute at UTS was that China actually owns at least a big part, or maybe the whole thing, of the Philippines' key electrical grid. And even though they're in this territorial dispute over the South China Sea, that you haven't seen that as leveraged as for China's benefit in the region, which I thought was an interesting point. What I want to ask finally on this South China Sea question is, should we care? Should we be there? Should we do anything about it? Or should we just let whatever happens happen in the region?
We, meaning here in Australia?
Australia, US.
I think we should definitely care. And while our options are relatively limited, it's not like we're going to invade those militarized islands and try and push the Chinese off it. Neither the United States nor Australia has any territorial claim there, right? The official policy is that we don't have a dog in the fight in terms of the sovereign claims. We simply want them to be resolved peacefully, and we want them to be resolved on the basis of international law, right? And in the meantime, what we will do is assert our lawful rights to operate in those seas according to international law. And that's considered provocative by China because they don't accept all the international legal views and decisions that the United States and Australia and others are using to assert their rights within the South China Sea. So what can we do? I think to a small degree, there's been some pullback on China's part. I think they got the message pretty clearly from the international community that this was not acceptable. It may just be a simple matter of one step back, and pretty soon we're going to see 2 steps forward again. That's a very classic Chinese tactic. Wait for the international situation to calm a bit, and then take measures to reassert themselves in those areas. But there's not a lot that can be done, except to bolster and I would say, bolster the political, diplomatic, and yes, military presence in and around the South China Sea, not just unilaterally by the United States or by Australia, but hopefully bilaterally, hopefully multilaterally with other claimant states in the region, to send the message to China that this is unacceptable and there's going to be pushback if they try again to further push out that envelope in ways that impinge on other persons' sovereign claims. And that ultimately, the answer here is to accept international law, arbitral tribunals' decisions, work with the other claimants to find a peaceable outcome.